What is up, guys? Welcome to part 2 of my Rewind Rumble Season 1 review. In this part I will be talking about the rest of Season 1. From Paper Mario vs. 2 Link all the way to the Reality Warper Free for All. And to be honest, I thought that part 1 of this series was fucking awful. First of all, the video was in 360p, the reason why is because I used a really crappy YouTube 2MP4 converter. Also, the script was super repetitive and I said the same thing over and over and over again. Every episode was so consistent in quality that I basically had nothing to say about most of the episodes. There isn't much wrong with them, they are all great. Even though the consistency in quality made Rewind Rumble a fantastic versus show, it didn't make for an entertaining analysis video. There were a lot of episodes that I just skimmed over that I could have said much more about, and there were a lot of missed opportunities for jokes. But the second half of Season 1 is much worse and there is a lot more to criticize, so hopefully this part is more entertaining. So let's jump right into it. The next episode that came out from where I left off was bonus episode 5. Paper Mario vs. 2 Link. This episode is amazing, but to me it was the decline in quality of Rewind Rumble. Allow me to explain. This is the first episode that started Rewind Rumble's chaotic and random schedule that hasn't changed to this very day. But other than that, this episode was great. The fight was really fast-paced and incredibly entertaining. Despite it being the first episode that started Rewind Rumble's messed up schedule, the episode itself is fantastic, and it is easily the best bonus episode. 10 out of 10. Next is bonus episode 6. Sonic vs. Lamech. This episode was really good. The first scene was great, but the second and third scenes were significantly worse. The second scene was decent for Cartoon Fight Club, but it didn't live up to the standard of Rewind Rumble and the animation was a lot stiffer than most other episodes. The third scene was supposed to be funny, however it didn't make me laugh, but to be fair, it's the only way that match could work. Also, I really did not like the idea of having these extra 2 rounds for an already one-sided matchup. I think this episode should have just been the first scene but longer, as the 2 extra scenes felt very forced, and they felt like they were just there to pad out the runtime. Overall, the amazing classic Sonic vs. Lamech scene more than made up for the episode's issues. 8 out of 10, it's closer to a 7 than it is to a 9. Next is episode 27. Garnet vs. Meng. This episode was really good. The animation was fantastic, but the actual fight was literally less than a minute long. I think that, if this episode was longer, then it would have been much better. 8 out of 10. Next is episode 28. Mr. Incredible vs. All Might. This episode was great. The fight was fast-paced and amazingly animated. My only complaint is that I found it weird that All Might got a voice actor, but Mr. Incredible just got text. 8 out of 10, it's on the border of being a 9, but I think the fight was a bit too short to get a 9. Next is episode 29. Nick vs. Disney. This episode is kind of a mixed bag. It was super short for a Total War episode, so I am just going to talk about every scene. Gabriel's scenes for this episode were all amazing, especially SpongeBob vs. Mickey. That scene on its own is kind of a masterpiece. But everything else was not great. Timmy Turner vs. Mickey was okay, but it did not hold up to the standard of Rewind Rumble. Lincoln Loud vs. Sully was unacceptably bad, and the fact that it got on Rewind Rumble is absolutely ridiculous. But from what I have heard, that scene was only a test animation and not a legit battle animation, let alone a Rewind Rumble animation. AR's scene also felt very rushed compared to his other animations for Rewind Rumble and it was not very good. Also, just like every single Rewind Rumble Total War besides the Reality Warper Free-for-All, the ending was really anticlimactic. The final scene was supposed to be funny, but it did not make me laugh. At least with the other Total War endings they had really great animation despite being kind of anticlimactic. This one does not even have that. Also, I found it weird how this episode was divided into 3 parts, when really it didn't need to be. Another complaint that I had with this episode is that a lot of the characters on the roster were barely in it. Mr. Krabs only made a cameo appearance and he didn't do any fighting, and more than half of the roster was just shoehorned into AR's big team scene with a few of them barely being visible. Overall, this episode felt kind of rushed and cobbled together. It was pretty clear that AR just took all of the random Nick vs. Disney animations he could find, and made this episode out of them. On the original Zim vs. Stitch video, Gabriel said that the animation wasn't for Nick vs. Disney. Also, Lincoln Loud vs. Sully was just a test animation. So to me, it's pretty clear that AR rushed this episode, even though he said that he would never rush a Rewind Rumble episode. There were a lot of scenes that sucked, but Gabriel completely saved this episode from being terrible. Also, his scenes were all together. Because of this, I can easily skip the bad shit at the beginning and end up on rewatches, and I do give the episode bonus points for that. 8 out of 10. I know I sounded a lot more negative than the score would suggest, but I really loved Gabriel's scenes. They definitely made up for a lot of this episode's problems. It's on the border of being a 7, but I decided to give it an 8. Next is episode 30. The horror movie Free For All. This episode was a much better war episode than Nick vs. Disney. Gabriel was the only animator and there weren't several forced scenes that detracted from the episode. Although it looked like one of Gabriel's older animations from 2017, it was still great and those old episodes are great too. My only complaint is that the Jason sprites looked absolutely nothing like Jason Voorhees. He didn't even have a machete, he just used his bare hands. 8 out of 10, it's closer to a 9 than it is to a 7. Next is episode 31. Ruby vs. Deku. To me this was the first not good episode of Rewind Rumble. The animation was good, and the start of the fight was actually really well done, but after the first few hits it slowed down a lot. There's a lot of dialogue towards the beginning and end of the animation, and then Deku finally delivers the finishing blow on Ruby. It was barely even a fight. The worst thing about this episode is the voice acting. The voice acting was Birdemic levels of bad, and it didn't help that there was a lot of dialogue. Both actors had really crusty microphones, especially the guy who played Deku. His performance was awful and his microphone sounded like Ralph on Sardonicast. Heck, even I could do a better job. In that stupid movie review video that I enlisted, my microphone sounds way better than Deku's voice actor. If I can do it, then there's no excuse why you can't. The analysis segments were really bad too. Both hosts sucked, especially TGF. He talks really slowly and over pronounces every word. It just makes his commentary really boring to listen to, and from what I have heard, Ruby was misrepresented and downplayed. Also, one interesting thing I noticed is that this episode has the most negative comment section of any episode of Rewind Rumble. Even HeOversees Bass got very positive feedback. Overall this episode was very subpar. The animation quality was great and there were parts of the fight that I liked, but overall it was barely even a fight, and the good parts weren't enough to make up for all of the episode's issues. 5 out of 10, it's closer to a 6 than it is to a 4. Next is episode 32. Rick vs. Bill Cipher. This episode was decent. The animation was good, but the fight was slower and less interesting than Il Chedaman's other animations. 6 out of 10, it's closer to a 7 than it is to a 5. Next is bonus episode 7. Superman vs. Beerus. This episode hasn't aged too well. When I first saw the episode I absolutely adored it, but over time I've started to like it less and less. The animation was really stiff and slow a lot of the time, and there was one scene in the fight where the hitbox was way off, however it still had its moments where the animation and fight choreography were great. It was pretty decent overall, but the animation was really stiff at times, and I feel like this episode is just gonna age worse and worse as time goes on. 7 out of 10, it's closer to a 6 than it is to an 8. Next is episode 33. Sonic vs. Goku. This episode was incredible. The fight was long, action-packed, and amazingly animated. It remained fast-paced throughout the entire battle, and it is easily one of the best episodes of the second half of Season 1. 10 out of 10. Next is episode 34. Batman vs. Tuxedo Mask. This episode was average, but I can understand why, since it went through production hell. Basically this episode was supposed to be animated by Smasher Block who did Pokemon vs. Digimon. But he got busy with school and he could not finish it. So AR had to finish it for him, and he did a decent job, but it was not very good by Rewind Rumble standards. Also towards the end there was a lot of noticeable reused animation from Mario vs Sonic. Smasher blocks and finished animation was really good, but there was barely any of it before AR's scene started, and the background looked like shit. However, the actual fighting looked good. The biggest problem with this episode is that AR rushed it and made it the next episode, before the original animator was even remotely close to being done. If AR just waited for Smasher Block to finish it, or if he got an actual Rewind Rumble animator like Drug to finish it, then it would have been much better. Oh well. 6 out of 10. Next is episode 35. SpiderMan vs Blue Beetle. This episode was amazing. The animation was really great and AR did a good job at debunking the original Spider-Man vs. Blue Beetle Cartoon Fight Club episode. Also, I really liked how Origin Animations implemented hand-drawn elements into the fight. I think he does it the best out of anyone on Team Animation Rewind. 9 out of 10. Next is episode 36. Saitama vs. Naruto. This is the most overrated Rewind Rumble episode of all time. It's one of my least favorite episodes, and at one point it was my number one least favorite episode. But over time I've started to dislike other episodes more, and worse episodes have come out recently. The animation was actually pretty good, but the fight itself was slow and really uninteresting. Also, the shooting stars meme at the beginning was not funny and it broke AR's no forced memes rule. Overall, I really did not like this episode. It just felt like filler, and it stuck out like a sore thumb compared to the great episodes that came before and after it. Also, the fact that this is the third most viewed episode of Rewind Rumble, while masterpieces like Red Hood vs. The Punisher hardly got any views, really ticks me off. 5 out of 10, it's closer to a 6 than it is to a 4. Next is episode 37. Sins vs. the Judge. This episode was phenomenal. I loved the animation, the hand-drawn elements were fantastic, the story elements were really well done, and I really liked the ending. Overall, I would take a dozen more Sans fights over another Sasuke fight any day, especially if they are as good as this episode. 9 out of 10. Next is episode 38. Dante vs. Kratos. This episode was pretty good. The animation was good and the fight was fast-paced. Overall, I don't really have any complaints. 7 out of 10, it's closer to an 8 than it is to a 6. Next is episode 39. Dante vs. Hellboy. This episode was really good. The animation was great and it was much better than the other Dante fight. 8 out of 10. Next is episode 40. Mewtwo vs. Cell. I really liked this episode. The animation was great, and overall I don't really have anything to say about it. 8 out of 10. Next is bonus episode 8. Simon vs. Hercules. This episode was great, and the fact that it got made into a bonus episode, while the next 3 episodes got made into full episodes is just ridiculous. The fight was fast-paced and very entertaining. Overall, this is one of the many cases of bonus episodes being better than full episodes. 8 out of 10. Next is episode 41. Wario vs. Bass. This is the worst episode of Rewind Rumble by far. I was expecting this episode to be subpar based on the teaser trailer, but somehow it was even worse than I was expecting it to be. In fact, the first 5 episodes of Cartoon Fight Club Season 4 are all way better than this episode, and they came out around the same time as this episode. Even Josh Medley's Cartoon Fight Night animations are better than this episode. The animation was perfectly fine, but the fight was slow, boring, and contained very little of interest. Also, the aspect ratio was clipping out and the forced meme sound effects were really obnoxious and unfunny. Also, in episode 3 of CFC Talk, Animation Rewind said that Cartoon Fight Club would be the Rewind Rumble rejects, and that Rewind Rumble would host the best high-quality episodes. So, how the hell did this episode make it in, while other infinitely better episodes got put on Cartoon Fight Club, also known as the Rewind Rumble rejects? Overall, this episode along with many other episodes made AR's promise that every episode would be great kind of false advertising. It really wasn't worth the month-long wait at all. 5 out of 10, it's closer to a 4 than it is to a 6. Next is episode 42. Vegeta vs. Dante. This episode is the best out of these 3 filler flops, but it is still nothing special. The animation was pretty good, but there were a lot of slow-paced moments where characters were just standing around doing nothing. Although Don's voice actor was good, Vegeta's voice actor was really bad. TGF is not a good host nor is he a good actor. Overall this episode was painfully average. 6 out of 10, it's closer to a 5 than it is to a 7. Next is episode 43. Black Panther vs. Blake. This episode was a lot worse than I remembered it being. I remember really liking this episode when it first came out, but before working on this script, I literally hadn't seen it since it came out, and upon rewatching it I can see why I had only watched it twice when it came out. The animation was good, but there were a lot of awkward moments in the fight where nothing of interest was happening, and the final attack was really anticlimactic and it felt like it had no impact. This match was already done on Fatal Conflict, and done much better. Overall it was alright for Cartoon Fight Club, but it wasn't Rewind Rumble tier. 6 out of 10, it's closer to a 5 than it is to a 7. And finally, after 6 months of delay, the season finale is here. Episode 44, The Reality Warper Free-for-All. After a lot of mediocre episodes of Rewind Rumble came out, I started having really low expectations for this episode. The large quantities of painfully average episodes made me worry that it would be the same as them. But after I finally watched it, it easily made it into the top 5 of the season. The only scenes that I did not like were Cosmo vs. the Genie and Bill Cipher vs. Bobo. Everything else ranged from pretty decent to absolutely amazing. One of the best things about this episode is that it fixed a lot of the issues with the previous Total Wars. It wasn't divided into parts for no reason, it had an actual story that made sense, and the final scene was incredibly satisfying. It felt like every scene was building up to the climax, unlike the other wars, where it was just a random fight compilation with no satisfying conclusion. The ending was one of my favorite scenes along with Sonic vs. Thanos, Doctor Strange vs. Beerus, and Sonic vs. Beerus. Overall this episode was totally worth the wait and it was a great way to end the season. It was a lot better than I was expecting it to be, and it was incredibly satisfying. 10 out of 10. Overall the second half of season 1 was a lot worse than the first half. The animation quality was very inconsistent, and there were a few episodes that I disliked. The first half was very consistent and it lived up to my expectations for the show. But the second half went off the rails with a lot of episodes having short and low quality animations. The show was advertised as being Cartoon Fight Club, but without the bad episodes, and consistently great animation. It was supposed to be the place where all of the high-quality episodes would be put, so that you don't have to search through several Cartoon Fight Club episodes to find one that's good. So the fact that there are episodes with lower quality animation and slow fights is kind of false advertising. The schedule was a complete clusterfuck. Sometimes there would be 5 daily uploads in a row, while other times AR would take months to upload the next episode. The bonus episodes were a lot better than the full episodes, while before it was the other way around. Paper Mario vs. 2 Link was much better than Garnet vs. Meng. Mr. Incredible vs. All Might was better than Nick vs. Disney. The horror movie Free for All was infinitely better than Ruby vs. Deku. Every episode that came before Batman vs. Tuxedo Mask was better, and Simon vs. Hercules was infinitely better than the 3 episodes that came after it. Overall it was kind of a mess, and so far in season 2, AR has not fixed any of these issues. But that is a different topic for a different day. Here is my top 10 best list for the season. Anyway, that's all for this video. I will review the pre-season of Season 2 once Spiro vs. Toothless finally comes out. Goodbye.